Welcome to Zoom In and Zoom Out, where we take an in-depth look at how news from Taiwan is affecting the rest of the world. Now, there have been several protests concerning migrant workers in recent weeks, not just in weeks, but years. Most recently, migrant workers and labor unions protested alleged labor rights violations outside Taiwan's tech giant ASUS. Protesters accused the company of trying to avoid giving out severance pay to migrant workers as ASUS tries to move their factories to Vietnam. Instead, the company is advising employees to look for jobs elsewhere, and this is just a symptom of wider social systems that trap migrant laborers in Taiwan. Now, to get a better understanding of the plight of migrant workers in Taiwan, we're joined by Bonny Ling, an international human rights researcher based in the UK. Bonny is a senior non-resident fellow with the University of Nottingham and the executive director of a social enterprise called Work Better Solutions. So, Bonny, welcome to the show.
Yes, hi. Good morning from the UK, and thanks for having me.
So, let's just dive right in. Where do most of Taiwan's migrant workers come from, and what kind of work do they do in Taiwan?
Taiwan operates with four formal corridors, meaning that there are four countries of origin for the migrant workers in Taiwan. So the four are Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And if we look at where they work, what kind of jobs do they do? So that's very much regulated by law. The Employment Service Act of Taiwan says that they can be placed in the two broad categories of productive industry, which is a broad term used to include things like manufacturing, construction, agriculture, fishery, farming. And the other category would be social welfare. So if you're walking about the streets of Taipei or any other city and you see a caretaker pushing the wheelchair of an elderly person, so that would be considered the welfare sector. So, I think it's important to look at this because Taiwan has four migration corridors, whereas South Korea has, more than 10, and Japan has also, they're operating with corridors up, double digits.
So, when you say there's a care worker section and there's a factory section, is there a difference in pay, a difference in how hard the work is?
So if you're a migrant worker coming from Thailand and you are in industry, well, you are covered by the Labor Standards Act, right? The Labor Standards Act, 劳基法, is like the bedrock document for labor protections in Taiwan. The idea is that no matter whichever work you're doing, you are covered by 劳基法, Labor Standards Act. However, if you are a migrant worker coming from Indonesia and you work in domestic care, you are excluded from the coverage of the Labor Standards Act. And this is a known problem that, you are working a lot of hours and you're not even meeting the minimum wage that is stipulated by the Labor Standards Act. So I think that's the biggest difference to come out when you talk about which sectors do you go. It's interesting to look at the absolute number of migrant workers in various, categories in Taiwan. So if you're a migrant worker in productive industry, the total number of those in productive industry outnumber migrant workers in care, in social welfare, this sector, by roughly 2 to 1, right? So they are about 750,000 registered migrant workers in Taiwan. So about 500,000 of migrant workers from this number is from industry. And then those who are in the welfare category is about 200, roughly 220,000. So I think, these are kind of like the dynamics we're looking at in terms of numbers.
So I think it's good for a worldwide audience to know about how migrant workers are treated in Taiwan uh, by the media, by employers, and just by society in general. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
You mentioned before that there are a lot of protests right now on migrant rights. So what is going on? One of the light spots for Taiwan is that we do have press freedom. We do have the freedom of association. So we hear of more protests because they're not restricted, right? Freedom of association is a fundamental human right because we need a peaceful mechanism where grievances can be expressed and then it could be addressed. So I think that is always a good thing. When, in discussions with people, when they say, oh, there's so many protests and there's a negative tone or something, I'm always very quick to correct it because I think the fundamental are good, where you have that, system of freedom that we value so much for Taiwan, right? And that is important, especially when we're seeing regressions on democracy worldwide. I think what's happening now is also there's more awareness of the type of violations, migrant rights violations in Taiwan, right? There are certainly health and safety issues, fires, right? Industrial accidents, the lack of provision of safety equipment, and things like that. But I observe, and this is where I think is a kernel of optimism that can come out of this environment of so much structural injustice, is that there seems to be more willingness from the media, by the public at large, to really try to understand just what is going on.
So let's zoom out a little bit to look at the problems you mentioned. Can you say more about debt bondage and undocumented workers?
Yes, I always return to this issue because for me, this is the root of the problem. A major cause of forced labor in the global supply chain is the charging of recruitment fees and recruitment related costs to migrant workers. And this can create a situation of debt bondage, and it leaves migrant workers at risk, very much at risk, to what we term, a very bad labor situation that meets the threshold of what we consider to be, human trafficking, modern slavery, just very bad exploitation. And you can imagine a situation where if you pay that much for your job, right, it's going to take you a lot for you to report abuse because you're coming at it with a lot of family expectations of doing well and then remit the money home. So your interest would be to pay that debt off as soon as possible so you can remit earnings back home. And we see this from evidence that if people are indebted, they're less likely to bring up their grievances. And by the time that we can intervene, the situation's really bad. I mean, abuse has happened. So I think we need to look at prevention at the other end. We need to think about how do we put in a labor system in the visions of what we want to see for our children. I mean, I'm not saying that to be tried, but I think right now we're looking at the world and we're seeing regression on human development, right? On the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And things are not good right now. So I'm always looking at what can we do to be closer to that vision of a decent work environment.
Why do migrant workers go undocumented?
I mean, there are reports by the government that acknowledges that the high debt that migrant workers carry before they come to Taiwan for work is actually a contributing factor to them absconding in Taiwan. If you look at the way they were recruited into Taiwan, if you look at even basic things like, substandard living conditions, fire hazards, excessive overtime, not being paid, their work in Taiwan is not what they expected, then it's a more complicated picture that requires us, all of us, to not only understand it as a legal issue, policy, but also empathy, and ask, what will we do in the same situation? Will we be making the same choices? Likely. And are we putting them at more risk? And let's look at the fact that there are children who are stateless in Taiwan, right? Those who are born to undocumented migrant workers. They are in our society and they're living lives in the shadows. And why? Why is the system persisting? And we need urgent change.
So, in your opinion, how do you think Taiwanese government can overhaul the system and help migrant workers?
I hear a lot of proposals, creating new things. But I think the brokerage system, we need brokerage system because if it is a process of matching a worker with job abroad, you do need the skills of people who can do that matching, that placement. The answer is really simple. Who bears that cost is wrong, right? Right now, we have a two-tier system where we expect that cost to be borne. If you are a high-waged worker, foreign worker in Taiwan, if you have to pay 5,000 US dollars for your job before you even start your job, you would know it's a scam, right? I mean, it would not be possible. So the question is, why do we have a two-tier system that does not make any sense? Why do we expect those who are the least able to pay for their job, right? Because if we look at it as a root issue, then that cost is wrong. Employers have more power of bargaining with the brokers to make sure that costing is done right. It does not work for individual migrant workers coming from places like Philippines and Indonesia to make sure that costing is right. We need that costing to be borne by employers. So I think the solution is kind of simple in a way. We need to make sure we put the costing on the people who is asking for the service and who has more the ability to negotiate, and it's not on the migrant workers themselves.
Why do you think it's in Taiwan's best interest to get it right?
We are at a crossroad, and I think it's an opportunity to nudge for change, for positive change, but it will require all stakeholders to kind of push. And one thing that I think it's really critical for Taiwan now, to the point where it's seen as a national security issue, is the declining population. Taiwan is a super age society very soon. In 2 years, by 2025, it will become officially designated as a super age society where 1 out of 5 residents are over the age of 65. So I think it's an immense demographic challenge. But I think it's also an opportunity for all of us to think about what is the meaning of citizenship. I know this is very contested in Taiwan, but I think the argument now is not only about doing the right thing for the sake of human rights. Of course, we should do that. But I think now the argument is also doing the right thing helps Taiwan in the long run to meet critical domestic labor shortages. And it's also better for the type of future Taiwan envisions in the Asian Pacific.
So, Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights on migrant workers in Taiwan.
Thank you so much.
This has been Zoom In and Zoom Out. You can find more of our stories on our website, TaiwanPlus.com, and on social media. I'm Bing Wong. Have a good day and even better tomorrow.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for Taiwan Plus.
Taiwan Plus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.